So today, obviously, I was just saying, Lebanon's witnessing an unprecedented economic crisis. The national currency is in a free fall. Economic sanctions are increasing. More are expected in the near future. Bilateral relations with the countries that traditionally helped or bailed Lebanon out are almost non-existent due to a number of factors, be it Hezbollah, the refusal of Lebanon to vote to suspend Syria from the Arab League, and a number of other issues. Today in Lebanon, as you all know, depositors can't access their dollars, their US dollars. Banks are imposing strict capital controls, despite no official legislation on the issue. Imports are becoming increasingly difficult to pay for due to the lack of available dollars in the market. Purchasing power is decreasing. Price of basic goods in Lebanon is increasing. And, the country is not producing, has not traditionally, historically produced much, and it counts on imports. Varying statistics. There's no official statistics that we are able to use or look at to know how much exactly is being imported or exported. You have numbers floating around. And obviously the economy is projected to shrink by, I guess it's 12% this year. At least half the government's budget is expected to be going to debt servicing. Number of Lebanese is increasing that are living below the poverty line. Then you have all of these coupled with varying estimates of the number of Syrian refugees in the country. So we know the main issues in Lebanon, but today we are fortunate to have 4 experts to discuss all of these issues and what challenges lie ahead for Lebanon and how this will impact the region. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the 4 of you, and please correct me if there are any mistakes in the biographies. I'll start Alia. You are the managing director. Alia is the managing director at Jefferies, an American multinational independent investment bank and financial services company. She's previously served as the director of geo-economics and strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and director of head of research for the Middle East and North Africa at Barclays Investment Bank. And you previously worked at the World Bank as well, and a managing director at Lebanon's Council for Development and Reconstruction. We have Ziad Abdel Samad. Ziad is the co-founder and executive director of the Beirut-based Arab NGO Network for Development, bringing together 35 NGOs from 12 Arab countries. The organization is active in monitoring and protecting the social and economic rights of individuals. And Ziad is also well-versed in civil society and an instructor at Lebanese American University, teaching on human rights, conflict resolution, and leadership. Nasser Yassin, associate professor of policy and planning at the Health Management and Policy Department at AUB, and the co-chair of AUB for Refugees Initiative, which brings together and builds synergy among faculty and departments in AUB responding to the Syrian refugee crisis. Nasser also researches and advises on policy and social innovation in areas of health, youth, and refugee policies and programs. And we have Albert Kostanian. Albert has now the famous show on LBC, Vision 2030. He's also the head of the Levant at Arthur Little, a strategy and management consulting firm, and the senior policy fellow for economics at AUB's Yassin Faris. So without further ado, I'd like to jump into basically what we just touched on. But at the beginning, I'd like to give each of you 2 or 3 minutes to give your general, if you will, oversight on what we just touched on, and then I'll jump into specific topics. So Alia, if you'd like to start, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this very great gathering with people whom I share a lot with, both historically and in terms of mind share, as we say. I mean, obviously, as you said, Lebanon is undergoing a typical sort of full-blown economic financial crisis where you have concomitantly a debt crisis, a balance of payment crisis, and a banking crisis, all very closely intertwined. But because of policy paralysis and delays, have actually morphed increasingly into political and socio-political crisis. Which renders the path of the solutions or overcoming the great challenges much more difficult, particularly also if we add that Lebanon basks in this very complicated region with its own geopolitical setup and risks. But I think when we look, I mean, and we spoke about numbers, when we look at numbers, I think the few numbers we have for the past 6 to 7 months, but also for this year, for the first 2 years, confirm what we see in any other crisis of this sort, i.e. a very sharp contraction of GDP, a very sharp contraction in revenues. I was just looking today at the first 2 months, 40% VAT down for the first 2 months of the year. Imports, of course, contraction. On top of it, you have a rise in unemployment, etc. So you have all the typical symptoms, but also manifestation of a full-blown crisis. Only the main difference, and this is why it will be challenging for us to deal with ourselves, but also with the rest of the world, is that first, the scale of it is very large. In terms of the losses that the government itself has identified. But second, and most importantly, is because those basically problems in terms of economic deteriorations could actually worsen simply because, as I mentioned, we are still behind on taking any concrete policy action to agree among ourselves on the diagnostic and on the path towards a solution, to define a strategy for negotiating with our international partners, and 3, put the setup for making sure that those who will be in charge for implementation of the reform will actually be able to do it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ziad?
Okay. I would like to start by mentioning 2 main comments. I mean, with your general overview about the economic and fiscal situation in Lebanon, Lebanon started negotiating with the IMF as a last resort in order to phase out from the crisis, or bidding on, let's say, additional loan of $10 billion in addition to the 11 billion committed in Sadr. So the need now is for $20 to $21 billion. Negotiations started a few weeks ago. And here I have, let's say, two main comments. The first one is, I mean, the way Lebanon is conducting negotiations with the IMF raises a lot of doubts about the real political will to reach or to conclude an agreement with the IMF in order, I mean, to apply to certain conditions or to certain demands from the IMF. I mean, the reform plans are being suggested since 2017. According to the report under the Article 4 agreement with the IMF, where everything was clear, highlighting the main challenges and highlighting the main reforms in what direction Lebanon should start doing. And then in 2018, after Sadr, the same, plans or reforms were suggested, and now we are witnessing the same, plan, which means that after 3 years of knowing what we are supposed to do in order to bypass or to overcome the crisis, we are still in the same block. We are not, doing any real effort in order to overpass the crisis. So this raises real doubts about the political will to, and this, from my perspective, means that either we don't have a political will really to conclude an agreement with the IMF, or this political, elite ruling now Lebanon are not able to take any reform decision harming their proper interest. And the second, comment that I will start with is, any reform agenda will take into consideration austerity measures with harmful social dimensions. While what we can see in the government reform plan, the social dimension is very tackled. It's very weak, and they don't even take into consideration any serious measures in order to alleviate, the social impact of the reform plan. Only a very weak or traditional safety nets measures or programs that they can be implemented by an international organization, but not by a government. Mentioning, unemployment, the increasing number of poverty, marginalized people who are losing their salaries or salary cut, etc. So these, this also reflects a little bit the seriousness of the government plan, which is mainly focusing on the economic and financial dimensions, neglecting totally the political dimension and the social dimension.
Okay, and I want to jump into that in a bit on the social safety and what you think is needed. Nasser?
Thank you, Joseph. I will add to what Alia and Ziad have presented briefly. And I want to say that it's not that the political elite or those in power, when they're different formations, whether they're now in opposition or in government, it's not that they don't intend to reform. As a matter of fact, I think they intend to keep the situation as is, and this is seen and acted upon intentionally. And what I fear most, that we're going to go into a decade of what I'm calling roughly a low intensity collapse, like the low intensity conflict. So we're not going to have a hard hit collapse that would or might actually bring in some solution as hard as it would be on many people in Lebanon. I think they would intentionally keep this collapse going gradually, step by step, into a low intensity meltdown or a gradual meltdown, because this would benefit them better than anything else. And I'm going to explain a bit what do I mean by this. I mean, by going into this low intensity collapse, it means they're going to adapt to it and make us adapt into the situation. The political elites were going to continue to capture whatever they can from the assets of the state and the economy. Look what's happening now around power and the electricity sector, as if nothing has been raised by technical people, by the activists, by everyone. Just business as usual. But more importantly, they're going to re-oil their clientelist machine. Because actually they can distribute now some resources, some food supplies, some agricultural products. Even some people in the mountain are distributing chicken. Albert will like this. Some of the politicians are distributing, telling us to plant whatever we can. All of this to make us adapt. And adaptation is not bad altogether, but in this particular case, it means that we're going to go into a long decade of gradual meltdown, and that would mean, never finding a real solution for our structural problems in Lebanon. Now, my other point is that the international community is going to buy into the discourse of stability, and they're going actually to buy into the idea that Lebanon, being in the European neighbor, is going to send refugees and migrants and Lebanese. This is what a lot of the officials have said time and again. I mean, from the previous government, from this government, it's always the security narrative and the security risk to Europe is brought up by those politicians. And it doesn't mean the donors are going to come in and support Lebanon, neither the IMF. I don't think they're coming soon, but they're going to supply some assistance to keep this collapse going gradually rather than a total meltdown, or rather than finding a solution. So we're going to be stuck in this limbo for a long period of time. And that's what I fear most. I have some ideas for how to overcome this, but I'll leave them for later.
Okay, great. We'll jump back in a bit. Albert?
Yes, in fact, what I can add to the discussion is that I believe this is not an economic meltdown. It's a total crash of the whole system. I believe that the whole Lebanese system that is built on some myth that are quite interesting has all fallen apart. The Lebanese, I believe what we were living is a continuity of the Lebanese war because we are still in a sort of a Cold War where memory has not been appeased and people are still taken in hostage. And this system was built around also some rent distribution mechanism from the central state to former warlords that give back a part of the subsidies to the people. And it was built on some myth that are all wrong and that are all dying. So the first one is that Lebanon is built, Lebanon can function only with the private sector, and public sector is not important. Public sector is just here to employ the people of the suzerain, the religious sect suzerain. So this has landed in a very inefficient system without any production of efficient public goods and with no infrastructure whatsoever. Everything is a failure in Lebanon. Electricity, telecom, transportation, waste management. There is not really a single sector that functions. The second one is this service. Lebanon is a service country myth. And this is one of the most dangerous. So don't produce anything, just sell banking and casinos and I don't know what else to the Arab state. And this had led us to an economy that produces absolutely nothing. So we know we don't have any industrial tissue in Lebanon. Yesterday I had a panel about agriculture, and it showed really a gap that is tremendous between the potential of the country and its use and what has been done. They did everything to destroy completely the agriculture, the industry, everything that is productive. A third myth is also about inequalities, that we can live with such a gap of income between people, and this will not pose a threat, a societal threat to the continuity of the Lebanese society as a whole. So this also has proven wrong because people today are very angry because that there is such a gap that exists, and we have no fiscal policy, we have no redistribution, we have no access to public goods as public schools or public hospitals to the unfavored part of the society. So this whole system that was built on those building blocks has fallen apart. And this is a good news, but the bad news is that I completely agree with Nasser that it will be a slow disintegration because the tenants of the system they still have means to perpetuate the system, and it will die slowly. It will not die abruptly. Today, Lebanon is facing a big challenge with a non-functioning governance system. And in fact, the decision-making process in Lebanon is quite interesting because the decision is always the smallest common possible denominator between all the power brokers and that share the power in Lebanon. So this results in a no decision, and we are seeing that now in the IMF or in the recovery plan, let's call it like that. They are struggling to take decisions. So once they put forward a decision, they just pull it back because someone else disagrees. So you have really no one to take a decision on behalf of the community and to assume responsibility. If it succeeds, so it's good. If not, you just resign. So we don't have that system. I would add also to that, because this is a subject that is very often ignored, and now it's becoming politically correct to ignore that. We have also a big problem of armed militias in Lebanon. So there is no real sovereignty, and we cannot just ignore that problem because there is a contract between all the people to say that this problem doesn't exist. No, there is a problem like that. That completely hinders the future of Lebanon and all the prospects of stability investment, because this should be resolved in a way, and we don't know how it will be resolved. So we are facing important challenges. So hopefully Lebanese are always resilient and they always find a way to emerge from crisis, but this time it will be pretty tough.
And I'd like to, I want to get back in a bit on the agriculture sector, because I know you had a show last night, but for maybe some of the audience here, they may not have either understood it, or if they don't speak Arabic, or realize, like you said, the sector that's being neglected that has so much potential in Lebanon. And I also want to get back, you mentioned the economic recovery plan. We'll talk a little bit about haircut and other issues that may or may not be in there. But Alia, I want to ask you, last month you had a tweet that you wrote about the four big deficits, nothing controversial, the four big deficits. And as you mentioned earlier, that there's no strategy or setup in place in Lebanon amongst the Lebanese officials to really get out of this crisis that they are in. So can you just maybe explain for people like myself, maybe just dumb it down a little bit, the four big deficits you mentioned, and maybe that helps in terms of building for a strategy or a setup future?
Sure. So indeed, I mean, I was just trying to hint that I mean, you cannot move forward with resolving a crisis by only as big as that of Lebanon, with all its multidimensional, not only the economic part, without addressing the big elephant in the room, which is really the problem of state capture. However, and its cost on the economy, on people, and on the quality of institutions who will be in charge first with engaging with the Lebanese citizens, negotiating and agreeing and partnering with the external world, and delivering on the reforms and on the improved services in the future. And for that, I mean, when you want to tackle these have to be dealt through dealing with these four big deficits. The deficit of trust, which everybody has been talking about, and we see it every day in the street, that there is a huge erosion, a frightening erosion of trust between the citizens and the population. And where I sit in financial markets, we give a risk premium there is a risk embedded when we see a country where there is such a huge deficit of trust. So moving ahead, you need to bridge this through the political process, obviously. The second deficit is the deficit of accountability. We know for a fact that Lebanon's losses are not only about financial operation. This is a prolonged period of whatever you call it, whether looting the state, basically grand corruption. I mean, all the indicators across the World Bank indicators, the doing business indicators, I mean, all indicate that there are a huge accountability deficits which need to be addressed through a recovery of assets, a solid procurement process that can improve the quality of public financial management within the state, but primarily really is a very solid and impartial and independent judiciary who is able to deal with this legacy of mischiefs over the last 20 or 30 years. And this is where we start closing this deficit of accountability, and we're not even close to that. The third deficit is the deficit of competence. I mean, it is impossible for a country to have accumulated that amount of losses without anybody realizing that these losses were being accumulated. So maybe it has to be partly, it has to do with the issue of accountability and political patronage and everything, but it has also to do with competence. The fact that we have been, all of us, talking about the solutions for the last 20 years, and yet none of these solutions may have been, were implemented, means that the administration did not have failed to move ahead, even with the help of people who have the proper level of competence to enact such a solution. And the fourth is the deficit of collaboration, which, as Albert said, I mean, we're going to negotiate with a divided authority. I mean, again, sitting here, we've seen Ukraine negotiate its IMF package, Egypt, Tunisia, Argentina. No one goes with the government speaking one language and the central bank speaking another language. No one goes without a document that has had enough national dialogue across society in order to ensure that there is the maximum common denominator among the various stakeholders when, as we all agree, this is an existentialist period that the country is going through. So we need to address these deficits. And I think now there is a movement, as you know, Zef, and of people saying that we don't want that a lot of Lebanese don't want funding from the international community without an attempt to improve at least the governance part that we've talked about in those, the accountability, the competence, etc., through the IMF negotiation process, i.e. having robust prior actions that ensures that as much as possible of these governance deficit and governance weaknesses are actually bridged.
Okay, and touching on that point, Ziad and Nasser, maybe this one is for you too specifically, but Alia mentioned that for the past 20 or 30 years, it's been the same talk and the same issues that nobody can solve. Since really 2015, the You Stink movement and the protests, we saw I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but there was the emergence of really the first, I guess, noticeable civil society movements being formed. They were becoming more vocal. They were trying to put forth some ideas and solutions. And then fast forward to the last parliamentary elections, there was only one MP really elected from that group. Now, how do you think that the civil society actors can influence policies and development in Lebanon in terms of the things that Alia just mentioned, because I think it's clear to the public that a majority of the political elite have been incapable or unable to take to either form the policies needed to prevent Lebanon from reaching the state that it's in today, or implementing any plans that they may have come up with that may have benefited the country. So I'll leave it to Ziad or Nasser, whoever wants to speak first.
Okay. Yes, indeed. Well, I think that it's more than that. It's more than the social movements. I mean, since 2015 or since the first شو بيسموه financial engineering implemented by the central bank, many experts and reports were written warning about the critical situation and that serious steps should be taken, and nobody was taking into consideration, I mean, all these concerns. So yes, definitely the social movements and the people's movement, but also, I mean, it was very, very, very clear. And that's why I was mentioning in the very beginning that we are in a real, let's say, political crisis and a real political problem. I think that what we are facing is not a simple economic and financial crisis. It's a real political crisis. And here I want to recall the very first slogans raised by the October Revolution, 17th of October, where really the first slogan, unifying the whole nation from Tripoli to Tyre, around the main demand, which is toppling the confessional system or the political system, which means that everybody now in Lebanon knows very well that the political system in Lebanon reached its, I mean, the impasse. It's not able anymore to reform itself, and we are in a real crisis. And I doubt we will be able to really find a proper solution unless we address the political, let's say, system or the political dimension. You mentioned the elections in 2018, and now people are talking about, let's say, early elections. I believe that within this, let's say, nepotic confessional system, with, let's say, the decision-making process outside the institutions means we are a failed state where, I mean, the decision makers are really, let's say, the informal groups, armed or not armed. I mean, no, I doubt that any elections or any political process can lead to a real change unless we start gradually implementing the constitution, mainly regarding the Article 95, which is talking about the elimination of the political confessional system. So, I mean, addressing the political crisis and the political problem is the starting point. And it's very clear from my side. Yassin and the revolution, etc. I mean, they all unified, I mean, the Lebanese nation around this main slogan, this political slogan. They were weakened when they, let's say, stopped focusing on the political dimension of the crisis. And it's proportional. When you start focusing on the political dimension, you see the mobilizations coming out. So that's why I believe that we are in a real political problem, and the problem is with a political dimension. The priority is for the political dimension.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you can't separate really any issue in Lebanon from the political situation.
No, it's visible. You can see it now. Reforming, let's say, the judiciary system, they are not able to nominate, I mean, everything. Reforming the energy system, they are not able to nominate this regulatory institution. Talking about the waste management, everything, you have this, let's say, power sharing or the divides among the different communities. And by the way, we are not talking about the communities are not benefiting from the system. I mean, the leaders of the communities who are, let's say, controlling the communities are the solo let's say, beneficiaries from this
Just
system.
without getting bogged down too much into the political disputes on it. I mean, but like you said, whether it's the October Revolution or the 2015 movements, the result in the recent past was that the government was forced to resign, and another government was formed, supposedly for the demands of the people. But here we are, a few months later. Here Lebanon is a few months later, then unable to implement any of the reforms that the international community is asking for. Even the Lebanese people, first and foremost, what they're asking for. So, sorry, Nasser.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add to Ziad's point, and the so far all the political movements outside the mainstream have been haven't matured politically in the sense that yes, we had unified slogans, and the demands were very clear, but also asking those in power to reform themselves is naive. And it will continue to be naive, unfortunately, because the system in Lebanon is is very deep. Lebanon is a deep state, although we think of it as a weak state. It's a deep state in the sense that those six or seven in power are quite entrenched, as Alia mentioned, in capturing the state and the assets and the economy and what's related to the economic activity directly or through their cronies. I mean, this is very clear in terms of what they do, and um, asking them to reform themselves and bring us reforms is an act of naivety, because they came up and put in a new government. It has some decent ministers who come from decent backgrounds, but as a matter of fact, they're just acting as Adib is with us here as a shadow. He would always remind us is that they are the shadow of those six and seven political leaders or groups who are in control of the state and the economy. And for this matter, it's not going to reform itself, and the reforms are not going to be easy, and they're going to be very painful. And I've read a bit about biology, and that those in power are like an octopus in Lebanon. You can't cut the arm of octopus because it regenerates itself. And the only way to kill the octopus is to put your hand inside its head and put it inside out. This is biologically how you kill an octopus. But metaphorically, the political system in Lebanon needs this complete overhaul. Now, I think many of us agree on this, but the cost of it is very, very high. No one is ready to engage in such costly endeavor to overhaul the whole system, because it will cost blood and poverty and misery and so on. So I don't have a real answer, honestly, except engaging in keep hammering the current system and really come together as social movements, as new political groups, as activists, as everyone, to really come together and maintain the pressure. And to maintain the pressure, not piecemeal on certain acts like we did in 2015 and later on, but actually maintain the pressure on the current system altogether. This is the only way. This is the only way. Understanding it might take time. Understanding it might not yield direct results, but this is the only way for the time being, without going to a very bloody and costly, complete overhaul at the moment.
Okay, Halia Albert, in terms of getting new faces into legislation or elected into government, the international community and even the domestic population in Lebanon, it would be more difficult for them it'll take longer to have these reforms or changes enacted, and it'll be a lengthy process without, as Nasser mentioned, hoping not to see any more bloodshed. But things that could be done potentially, and both of you or all four of you know a little bit more than I do on this, are actual reforms, be it we've heard in the banking sector and as you mentioned earlier, fiscal policies that might be non-existent. And as we've seen, in the past couple months since the protests broke out in October is back and forth between government officials and the banks, both trying to place the blame on each other. Sometimes the central bank is not seeing eye to eye with the Association of Banks in Lebanon and vice versa, and it's just everybody's trying to put the blame on one another. Now, in the economic recovery plan, the one that was put forth by the government, there was talk of a, and both of you might know more than I do on this, of be it, how can I say it, there's certain things on haircuts which I'd like to touch upon, because in Lebanese media and even in foreign media, that was a big concern, be it foreign bondholders, or even people that have their money in banks in Lebanon, and why this hasn't gone through. Even if I believe the plan, if I'm not mistaken, says that it will affect 2%, this haircut if it went through. Why this hasn't happened? Why the capital control law has not been passed, even though the IMF has strictly called for it. There's so basically three things I want to touch upon: the haircut, the capital controls, and I get that might fall under it, as well as you have the excuse me. Let's touch on those two, and then I'll get back to the third. I gotta find it. How come the capital controls has not gone through, other than political will? Albert?
Yeah. So the question is for me, Joseph? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, the globality of the plans, the plans were perceived and presented as being dogmatic plans that were presented without any groundwork of preparation and consensus building. This is one point. Second, this government, to present a plan, a reform plan that is by essence bloody and painful. When you are in a crisis, all the plans that you're going to present will be painful. Nothing is rosy in the situation today. So you need to have a popular legitimacy. Usually normal countries, when they go into austerity or loss distribution measures, what they do is they call for early elections to get a popular backup to enforce their plan. In Lebanon, nothing as such happened. And the government just initiated and came out with a plan. And this plan came out of a black box with Lazar, so the people didn't really know who made that plan and whose interest does that plan serve. This being said, I'm not very negative on the plan. I believe the plan has some good elements. But to go back to your question, so first of all, you need a political endorsement that was not here, a popular endorsement that was not here to proceed with the plan. Second, the unilateral backing of the government by one side of the political spectrum made this plan look very suspicious. And perception here is reality. Because I believe that the plan was done on scientific grounds, with good acknowledgement of losses, which the Lebanese political class denied for years and years, especially the last months. Here you have a recognition of losses, but the unilateral backing made it look like someone was coming to absorb or to assassinate the banking sector in Lebanon, which I believe was not the aim of the plan. But so this is a second point. Third point is that The mechanism were not clear. I believe that the plan lacked a lot of coherence. We felt that many people wrote the plan. It was a potpourri of many ideas. And it was not shared by the banks, by BTL, by the wider public. The issue of the haircut, which is like you rightfully said, it's confined or contained within the very high net worth. The 2% is not present in the document. It's a verbal statement by Prime Minister Ziad, but this was not very well advertised. What people retain, the public, is that there is a haircut. They are going to steal our money. No one explained to the public that we are lacking alternatives here. So if we must function the top 2% to save the 98 remaining percent. No one explained that. It was just the mean government is going to function the 2%. So I believe they did a very lousy job in communicating it properly. And the banks did a good job in counter-attacking with a plan that I believe doesn't address really the core problem, which is the dollar's debt of the central bank towards the Lebanese commercial bank. For me, this is an essential part of the problem that is completely absent from the ABL, the Lebanese.
But do you think it's the government did a lousy job, or do you think that because that 2% could be a big chunk of the political elite, which is why this haircut didn't go through?
Also, it's a big chunk of the political elite. They wanted to wipe the equity of the banks. And you know that banks and politics in Lebanon are in bed. Those are practically the same people. So of course this faced resistance, but I still believe that they did a really lousy job. They didn't explain it, and they could have done much better. And they have also this problem of origin, that is completely how this government was formed, who is backing that government, the lack of popular legitimacy that completely killed the story. The capital control is a different story. It's a mix also of irresponsibility, unprofessionalism, and demagogy. So at first they didn't want to recognize that this was irreversible. And I believe one main politician, so mainly Speaker Nabih Berri, who is entrusted by his community to safeguard the funds of a lot of Shia expatriates from Africa, felt that he should defend his community and prevent the capital control. This is what happened, because he blocked it. And he was also getting confusing signals from experts and from the government and from the political class, saying that capital control will destroy the reputation of Lebanon, as if Lebanon reputation was really at its height. So this was, but I believe he did it to safeguard his community cash. And then the situation evolved, and everyone eventually understood that this cannot continue like that, and that they had to take action. So they took like 8 precious months to realize something that was quite obvious since day one. And now they have drafted a bill which is co-signed by Amal, so the party of Speaker Berri, to install a kind of capital control with also some flexibility for less than $50,000 per annum transfers outside the country. Right. So we lost a lot of time to digest and to understand something that was pretty clear from day one.
Alia?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when you have a balance of payment crisis and huge capital outflows, and you know that and not only are your reserves actually running thin, but actually you are in negative equity or negative reserve position, you should have imposed such capital controls much earlier on. I remember very well, I was on Al Arabiya Arabic channel since last October, and saying that out loud that this is what should have been done, and that basically let's learn from Egypt if we want to stick to our neighbor and don't want to go and look at other emerging market countries. This is how it is. You impose controls, you ration your use of foreign exchange, and you prioritize. You prioritize based on a critical policy objective. I mean, the little amount of dollars that is available should go first, for example, to companies that have the potential to export, or companies that employ a large number of people, so that we reduce or mitigate the impact on unemployment. So there are a lot of policies that could have been done and should still be done, even irrespective of the negotiation of the IMF, that can still limit the damage, because so far we are in a legal limbo where there's no law that can justify not allowing a capital outflow, but there's also no law that tells you how you can control whenever you want to impose them. And that is again a confirmation of the weakness of institutions. When institutions don't have the authority and legitimacy inferred by the law to push forward such a law, but rather go do political brokering to shape it against the political interests of local elites, then that is only a reflection of the weak institutions that we've talked about. But I want to go back to something else, to say that I think, I mean, while we are talking about an ongoing meltdown, a lot of negativities, I still also would like to point that there is a lot of work that have been done by still people within the administration, but also with civil societies, on reforms that are important and what we call macro-critical. Again, from an economic point of view, that we need to proceed with, irrespective of what happens with the IMF. And those are obvious. I mean, again, I mean, we're bored of repeating, we need an electricity reform, start with that in terms of good governance, improving, reducing technical, non-technical losses, doing a regulatory authority, getting the proper procurement process for and work with international financial institutions. The other pillar of the reforms that should go ahead irrespective is really, and I believe today, I just read in the news that the parliamentary commissions have started finally discussing the draft law on public procurement reform that has been worked out with the help of the OECD, the World Bank, and by the Ministry of Finance and the Institute of Finance itself, and to align it with international standards, to strengthen the independence of the procurement authority. So this is another very important pillar that could contain corruption. We need to build systems. So that's what building systems that align with international standards. We should proceed with doing it, work with champions within the administration who are trying to do their work, and see that these reforms can deliver or pass as soon as possible. Now, why is this important? Again, where I'm sitting in markets, because obviously Lebanon is going to reach a stage where it has to show that whether it's this government or any other government, that it has been serious about what it claims to be to want to do, i.e., implement reform. Then you have to show that you have a track record of passing laws that are in line with international standards. Not, for example, like the laws that have been undermined last week in Parliament, like passing a banking secrecy law, but not allowing the judges to investigate So on one hand, you're saying all the right things to the international community and to the financial markets, but when it comes to delivering on those, again, there is this big gap. So we have to make sure that we reduce this gap, and that Lebanon proceeds with these reforms irrespective, building on the efforts of those who are trying to push in that direction, be it within government or with civil society, which is represented by many of people around in this webinar.
Great, thank you, Alia. Sorry, guys, we're right at an hour, so I don't want to take up too much more of our time. I just wanted to see if there were any other questions from the few people that aren't panelists in this group right now. Adib, I noticed you have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I have actually some thought to share with you if we still have time.
Yeah, if you have a question,
okay. Okay, now I will just raise an issue. I think that what has been discussed is extremely important, and we need to keep putting the pressure to along what has been proposed. But actually, I think we need to know what is the essence of what is going on in Lebanon. What is the core and what is the periphery? All what we have been discussing are, according to my the periphery, which is important. But also look at the core. What is being done now is not an economic or financial crisis, it's not a regular political crisis. We are facing a process of radical change by force of the nature of the state and of the society and the country that is called Lebanon. So the approach to the economy, the approach to financial, to the banking, is an instrumentalist and utilitarian approach. So the people who have the power, actually, they may now propose in 1 week another plan, another economic or financial plan that is completely the opposite of what is presented now. They can accept capital control, they can refuse capital control, they can do anything, because we are not facing a normal state with the normal function. The only function of the state now is just an auxiliary to the real power. The power is not in the state, in the institution. The power is outside. That's why you cannot compare with Egypt, you cannot compare with anywhere else, because the government is not the government. They are not. So these people who are taking the power, they are not now actually, there is this process of having a negotiation with the IMF. But actually what will be done and what is really ongoing is a bargaining between the real power and the real global power to sell services to the regional and to global power. The function of the state, there is no notion of a neutral state, of a relatively autonomous state apparatus that manage the. We are facing an extreme case of a neo-patrimonial predator state, where the main thing is to get your share from the spoil, and everything is a spoil. So this is extremely dangerous. That's why, yes, according to the scenario that was presented by Nasser, and I agree with him, they are trying to make people adapt and live and to cope. This is the magic of coping strategies with everything. However, we have on the political level contradictions that are so strong that they may make the country explode. So we have like a race between this low intensity conflict and what may be the reality, which is a total explosion. That's why I think we need to go a little bit outside the conventional thought when dealing with the situation of Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you, Adib. I have Lauren. Were there any other?
I don't think anyone else has other questions outside the moderators, not the moderators, the participants. So yeah, Joseph, if you have any final questions.
I think this has been a great conversation. I'd like to continue maybe in a follow-up. I don't want to take too much of your time, more than we promised. But I have one other question or pointer. There's been, as you all know, a huge run on the dollar for the past couple of months, U.S. dollar in Lebanon, and I believe on tomorrow, Wednesday, that the licensed exchange shops are going to end their strike and they're going to start. Apparently, they're going to open. And one of the things that I wanted to speak about earlier were the different parallel markets in Lebanon in terms of, as some of our audience might not know, the dollar has been pegged to the Lebanese pound since 97, is it? I believe. In any case, there's talk that now with this step tomorrow, there's going to be efforts to bring down the black market value, if you will, of the parallel exchange rate to I read earlier on LBC to 3,200. Right now, it's hovering around 4,100. If you guys can just all for it, because I think this has an impact on obviously Lebanese just residents, Lebanese businessmen and women, commercial, people that need to import. And it also has an impact on refugees as well that are stuck in a limbo, whether be it Syrian or others. So maybe each one of you can speak, just touch on that topic a little bit, and how either unlikely it is, maybe Alia or Albed, that it is that the value will come back down, or if it will continue to rise. And then maybe Ziad and Nasser, you guys can speak about either just the ordinary Lebanese resident, how this will impact him, and even Syrian refugees specifically. Maybe Nasser. Nasser, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, maybe Ali and Albert are more versed on this, but I'm gonna observe as a researcher and say, even in Syria, where there's a regime that can control the lives and actions of everyone, and couldn't actually control the value of the dollar to the Syrian lira, because this is related to a lot of other factors, including supply and demand, but also including trust and so on and so forth. And I think Ali and Albert would perhaps touch also on the issue of balance of payment. As long as we're still suffering on this, I don't think any technical action and technical solution would actually solve this huge major issue, as Alia put it, as a deficit in trust. And of course, it's related to the other deficits we have in the country. So I'll leave it to others. Maybe they're more versed on this. But the impact of the current situation, and I've counted actually around 7 values for the dollar to the lira at the moment, is opening ways to a lot of corrupt and practices of some people just going around these different values and going around in a way that harms the citizen and harms everyone that actually gets along in their jobs and go after that to see all these different values. I think this is just a sign of the weak institutions we have in the country, and I'm not so optimistic we'll have a solution soon.
Alia, I saw you smiling and shaking your head. I'm going to give the floor to Ziad. And then...
I mean, there are fundamentals, basically, that relate to the fact that Lebanon has a huge negative foreign reserve position at the central bank, with a central bank that is running losses, that could range from anywhere, depending on what exchange rate you adopt, between $60 billion and $100 billion. There is no way any citizen can have enough trust in carrying the Lebanese pound or restoring confidence in the Lebanese pound without addressing this huge loss. which in itself is a very controversial and needs to be tackled with a lot of political wisdom, I would say, in order to ensure that we have what we are hoping for, an equitable burden. But as long as this loss is not dealt with, and that will imply huge policy trade-off, that will imply partly a devaluation of the currency. So until people start realizing what is the policy framework and the policy trade-offs that the policymakers and the society is willing to accept, then they will start making their choices and pricing in where the currency can go, and therefore go back to it. The problem, obviously, is that the longer this limbo and the lack of decision and adjustment takes place, the bigger is the risk of lirification, and therefore the erosion, sort of the indirect haircut that is affecting all the Lebanese, and particularly the lower and middle class, exacting on them a worse, a huge loss in terms of purchasing power, but also, as Nasser said, encouraging a bigger cash economy, which it will be very difficult to reverse in the future.
Albert?
Yes, I totally agree. So the fundamentals are not here. So I believe that the Lebanese pound will continue to depreciate, and all those gimmicks they are putting, it's like Sudan and Syria and Iran at some point. All those regimes and all those failed states, they always try to put some curtain walls between them and the reality, and they create subsidized rates for some products. So unfortunately, I believe this will continue because no one will have the courage to take the right decision, and I expect the Lebanese pound to continue devaluating until we reach an equilibrium, which will not be reached very soon. So I'm very pessimistic on that.
Ziad, you mentioned earlier that austerity is needed, and this will obviously impact different.
Joseph, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a time constraint.
Okay.
So I should leave at 6:15.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. Sorry, that's my fault. We went over.
Thank you.
Take care. Ziad, and you had mentioned that there's no social or safety net programs. There was talk of a few recent days by the government, but how do you think what we just discussed will impact, even if they pass, let's say a specific program? I mean, maybe a month ago they were giving out a couple 100,000 in Lebanese pounds, which, I mean, in the reality of things, they're going to the supermarket. It might, suffice for one trip for one family, depending on the size of the family.
This is exactly what I was mentioning. This is one of the main defaults and problems of the recovery plan suggested by the government, which includes only some safety nets measures or programs, and it's not taking into consideration, I mean, the scale of the social crisis or the impact of the economic and financial crisis at the social level. What we really have to envision is a universal social protection system, which is taking into consideration the increasing number of unemployed people, the increasing number of poor or people losing their jobs and losing their, let's say, the purchasing power of their wages. So this is something very important. But let me go back to your initial question. I think that there is a big problem here. Talking about the capital control and the haircuts, actually, they are both being implemented illegally. I mean, there is a real capital control in the banks, implemented by the banks without any law and illegally, which is only, let's say, reaching the ordinary people. But the people in power or the powerful people are still able to send their money outside the country because there is no law preventing them. Talking about the haircut, I mean, talking about the depreciation, talking about the inflation, talking about the currency depreciation means that there is a real haircut happening without even any law. which means that all the measures that they were being negotiated in Lebanon are being implemented illegally without any law and harming let's say, the middle and the lower class in the nation, which means that, I mean, I believe that there will be kind of a mounting tension, and this will reach a certain moment where this will explode in the streets. And now we are witnessing, let's say, calls and invitations and statements inviting people to go to the streets. Saturday there is something, and etc. So this will be mounting until we reach something. And that's why, I mean, not reaching laws or approving laws in the parliament has a very negative implications on the population and the political stability in Lebanon.
Great. Well, thank you, Ziad, Alia, Nasser. I really appreciate your time, and apologies if I went over a couple minutes past time.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Lauren.